Well, as you can see by the board, we're going to be talking about Europe right now and some regulations happening up, some new markets and some existing markets that have opened up in Europe in the last few years. Yesterday, we spent a whole lot of time speaking about the United States, not least because of the indictments from Black Friday and last Tuesday. But we recognized that was going to happen and that day one was going to be very North American focused. So we wanted to make sure that we had a panel together that could talk about pretty much everything you wanted to know about what's happening here in Europe. So we put that together. We've got Jake Pollard is here. He's going to be discussing, he's from iGaming France, so he's going to give us some insight into what's happening in France and what many people consider their completely botched market. We have Stephen Kettley, who is with Berwin Leighton Paisner. They're a law firm out of the United Kingdom, and he's going to give us kind of a overview, not only on the United Kingdom, but he's also going to help us speak about Italy, Spain, and Germany. Rolf Sims is the legal advisor to the Norwegian Ministry of Culture, and John Hagen is a partner at Harris Hagen. And John's going to help us with Sweden, Denmark, and Belgium. And of course, Rolf is going to help us with Norway. I'd like to keep the panel and discussion group open at any time. So if you have any questions at any point, please just raise your hand and ask the specific panel person that you want to ask the question to. We'll bring you a microphone so that everyone could hear. Jake, I'm going to start with you because you sat closest to me. Can you give us a quick breakdown of what's going on with the new French regulation and what you expect will happen in, I think, 6 months or so when they review the regulation and suggest changes?
Hi, afternoon, everyone. Quite simply, as probably a lot of you know, the French market has opened up to mixed reviews, to say the least, for the reasons that we all know of, heavy taxes, restrictive product offering. Obviously, casinos are not allowed. Online casinos are not allowed. Generally speaking, operators are not particularly happy. Poker is said to be, performing slightly better, even though it's still heavily taxed. Quite simply, there's a review clause at the moment. There's a review clause due at the end of the year. They've had parliamentary hearings for the Senate and the Parliament. It's difficult to say exactly what's going to happen. Some people are, the sports betting operators in particular, are hoping for a change of taxes from stakes to gross gaming revenues, which would alleviate some of the tax burden on their operations. I don't think it's going to happen. Some of the operators are slightly more optimistic. So it would be quite, if the taxes would change from stakes to gross gaming, it would be quite a good change. It would be a very good change for the industry. We'll find out closer to the end of the year, but generally speaking, it's a tough market, and you have to have the funds to tough it out for at least, the next year, 18 months. If you can tough it out until then, and you're left standing by that time, you might have a good chance to be successful in it. But that really, long and short of it is, there won't be major changes. If there is that one change, it will be pretty positive for the industry. The rest will stay very much as it is, with the obvious effects of a market that is not exploding like everyone expected. Media revenues for advertising and the like are not as high for various media, B2B, B2C, affiliates, online, offline. But that's generally the state of play at the moment.
I'm going to skip over to Rolf now. Could you tell me a little bit about how everything is going in Norway since your implementation of a payments ban for iGaming, and generally what's developing in your market and what plans you have going forward?
Norway is still a closed jurisdiction and probably one of the most strictest countries in Europe when it comes to regulation of gambling. Can you hear me in the back there? Yeah. At present, in Norway, the whole Norwegian market is basically anchored in two state monopolies, taking 75% of the turnover. The rest is bingo, which is terrestrial. In Norway, we don't allow interactive gaming like casinos and poker. We do allow our state monopolies to use the internet as a channel of distribution to terrestrial gaming. And like you mentioned, Michael, last year we implemented a payments ban in Norway, which has been semi-effective. taking about, I think we've stopped something like 30%, 40% of the revenues to online gambling. Basically, we think we've stopped many spontaneous first-time players. But we've always said from day one that a payments ban is not going to stop internet gambling. And that was never the intention. The whole intention was basically to make people think when you go online. It creates an extra hurdle when people want to access gaming which doesn't have a Norwegian license. With regard to possible interactive gaming in Norway in the future, we are working on a possibility for that, but it will probably be within a state monopoly model, which is in line with Norwegian tradition when it comes to regulation of gambling.
What time frames do you have for introducing the possibility of the state
Well, what we've done
monopoly?
is we've asked, we have this company, Norsk Tipping, which is the biggest state monopoly company. They've been given a mandate to come up with an evaluation on the possibility of interactive gaming in Norway, possibility how this can be done, what sort of games, how this can be offered in a social political context, and also with regard to problem gambling. And we're probably looking at a 2-3 year perspective. Because, like I said, this hasn't been politically sanctioned. We've just asked them to come with a proposal, and then it has to be sanctioned by the government, and then we have to do a law proposal in Parliament, and we have to go through Brussels with the notification. And since we seem to stick with monopolies, we'll probably get an infringement proceeding against us from Brussels. So we're looking at several years ahead.
Okay. John, give me a brief overview on what's going on in the rest of the Nordic region and in Belgium.
Okay, how long have you got? I think it probably makes a good contrast from Norway to immediately start talking about Denmark. Basically Denmark is, in terms of the trend towards national licensing regimes, Denmark's probably as good as it gets, I would say. They approved their legislation back in June last year. You're looking at licenses for sports betting, casino, poker, and it's due to be implemented on a date to be set by the Ministry of Taxation. Unfortunately, and it's very frustrating for the industry and obviously for Denmark, it's been delayed by a state aid investigation by the EU Commission. The land-based operators are saying, well, it's not terribly fair. We're paying tax at anything between 40 and 70%. Online's going to pay it at 20%, and the EU is looking at that. The Danish Gaming Board is hopeful of a positive outcome, but there isn't any plan B. They're well down the road towards opening up the market to foreign operators. They've got a great regime planned to open now, subject to a positive ruling from the Commission on the 1st of January next year. And very practical approach. Poker players, international liquidity, they don't have to just be from Denmark, unlike in France where it's confined within the jurisdiction. Your servers can be outside the jurisdiction as long as there's appropriate arrangements in place between Denmark and the home regulator. All in all, a good-looking system. Sweden, again, a good contrast to Norway. Sweden is a good regime at the moment. I mean, there's no compelling case for change. Their regime applies to local land-based to local operators in Sweden. If you're based outside the jurisdiction, it doesn't have extraterritorial effect. There's nothing to stop you going after the Swedish marketing in there. There's a ban on advertising in Sweden itself, which actually is in court today, I think, in Sweden. There's a hearing for the Court of Appeal. I'm hoping that, unlike a few in this room, none of their lawyers were at the party last night. But unfortunately, the ban is expected to be upheld following a preliminary ruling of the ECJ last year. Interestingly, just in preparing for this, I spoke to a Swedish gambling lawyer, Ola Wiklund, some of you may know, and he was saying the mood has really changed in Sweden, and they're just at the beginnings of thinking about whether they might move down a licensing regime. It would be a long way off, but the politicians are now they've done their homework. They're motivated by the idea of bringing Swedish companies back to Sweden. They'd be looking at, he said, possibly a UK-style model. The reason for that being that if you were to introduce ISP blocking or in Sweden, it would be political suicide. So, you know, Sweden's good at the moment, and even if they were to go down that route, it's looking fairly favorable in the long term as well. Belgium, another model entirely. They're also about to start issuing licenses. A new regime came into force from the 1st of January of this year. Sounds good at first, but there's a catch. Only existing land-based operators in Belgium will be allowed to apply for the licenses. The government says that this is to protect their citizens from fraud, problem gambling, the usual arguments. And opponents say that this is, including the Remote Gambling Association, say it's blatant protectionism and a breach of freedom of establishment because you're required to have your servers there. Not looking so good in Belgium, but there are opportunities there. There are opportunities to do deals with existing land-based operators in Belgium and target the market that way. I think I've probably spoken for long. Did I miss one? Was there?
Let me see. Denmark, Belgium, Sweden. You've got them.
Got them. Okay.
Sorry about my voice. It's mainly CalvinAir.com's fault. Stephen. Stephen. Now, if you could tell us a little bit about what's going on in the UK. John referenced the UK model a minute ago. And maybe also give us some color onto the existing regime in Italy, the fractious movements of Germany, and the great possibility of Spain.
I mean, it's also different, isn't it? I mean, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there are some, maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, there's some interesting cultural and socio-economic reasons as to why things are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The UK, I mean, if you looked at this industry about 2 or 3 years ago, the only place that you could really, other than the offshore, go and get a license and operate properly was in the UK. And now there are other opportunities presenting themselves, and the UK, ironically, now seems to be reviewing theirs to see whether theirs, in fact, is the right one for them. The UK had an interesting debate about 5, 6, 7 years ago when they wanted to open up their market to online gambling and introduced legislation enacted in 2005, implemented in 2007, which essentially allowed you to get a license to conduct almost all types of online gambling. They didn't try and prohibit people from offshore targeting the UK. They didn't try and tax them or license them. They introduced the whitelist concept, which was recognized that a number of the operators were already licensed offshore, and this was going to make it easier for them to remain offshore, but equally make sure that they were up to scratch as far as regulation was concerned. So pretty much a year ago now, there was a consultation by the DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which oversees this in the UK, which favoured one particular model, which was essentially the transactional licensing model. Therefore, if you transacted with a UK citizen, regardless of wherever you were, then you were going to need to get some form of license within the UK. The consultation period was, it sandwiched a changing government, and it kind of seems to have sort of disappeared. If you speak to the UK regulator, they, I think on their own admission, are a little surprised that things haven't necessarily moved as forward as quickly as I think we would have expected. But there are some interesting things in the background to remember that gambling is not the most important thing on people's agenda at the moment. And there are other things that the DCMS have to worry about, notably the Olympics. So it's not necessarily as high on everybody's agenda as we sometimes think. I mean, John and I were just talking about this before. I think we both share the same view, and you can chip in afterwards, that things will change in the UK. There will be, I think, some form of transactional license required by people targeting the UK market, because why wouldn't they? I mean, we seem now that we tried to be open for the industry, and now the UK seems to be perhaps slightly behind the curve here, and I think may begin to look a little naive if they don't go down this route. One interesting thing, though, to point out, I think, is remembering how European law works, and you can't just require people from other member states to get a license unless there are certain conditions that have been satisfied. I'm not going to go into European law now, but I think we all know what they are. It's interesting to note that the UK, when they enacted their legislation, made it clear, explicit within the UK legislation, that they considered Gibraltar to be, as far as regulation was concerned, up to scratch. If you look at the Gibraltar market and you look at the UK market, I understand around 80% of bets struck in the UK, sports bets, are with Gibraltar operators, and 65% of gaming transactions are with Gibraltar operators. It's going to be quite difficult, I think. There is a challenge for the UK government to persuade the European Commission that they need to change their system in order to protect the player, when their system apparently already seems to do that. So I think there are a few interesting political manoeuvres required in the UK to get that through. Germany and Spain are developing, as we know. I mean, the Spanish law has now gone through the Parliament. It's waiting for the King to sign it. It's not dramatically different, I think, to the Danish model. It's essentially allowing you to get a license for almost all types of transaction you want to undertake. They seem to be allowing for elements of your equipment and everything to be offshore, but I think the devil will be in the detail. In Spain, secondary regulations haven't been published yet, and I think once they are published, we will then begin to work out whether this is a favourable or not licensing regime. But it's obviously going in that direction. The Germans have decided to have a very restricted opening. I think we all know 7 licenses, sports only, reserving gaming to the state monopolies. I think that that's got an awful long way to go before that really takes off, because I think as the people were on the previous session were saying, it's open to a significant challenge. You had Party there saying they are going to continue doing work in Germany at the moment. There's the Schleswig-Holstein, one of the Länder have now gone down the route of getting their own, introducing their own licensing regime, allows you to get a license there. The European Commission, for all intents and purposes, blessed that. So that's going to happen as well. The conflict between state and federal law in Germany is an interesting one. If you're going to go and get a license in Schleswig-Holstein, does that allow you to transact throughout federal Germany? Some will say it would, some will say it won't. So I think that's another wait and see what's going to happen, because that's a particularly interesting market for so many of the operators, as we all know. Uncertainty, really, in the German market. Italy was, at the forefront, really, other than the UK, in opening its market up to private operators. They finally got around to allowing for casino and for ring games, and I think that the Italian model will be an interesting one for people to continue to watch and see how it develops. I think that it will continue to mature. I think it'll be interesting to see from a business, financial, analytics point of view, how that market develops, whether, as people were saying earlier, smaller operators with 1%, 2%, 3% liquidity are snapped up by the larger operators. I do think this pan-European regulatory framework favours the larger operators, but maybe we'll come on to that later. So I think it's really interesting. I think from a lawyer's point of view, from anybody's point of view, just to see how things change on an almost daily basis. It keeps us all busy, but I think it does make for a very interesting environment.
So we've talked about 7 or 8 different jurisdictions. We almost have 7 or 8 different models that are being applied. I suppose generally you're looking at 2 basic frameworks. You're talking about either a monopoly where the state will run its own gaming, and that's generally occurring in states that have monopolies over gaming. And then you're looking at a more liberalized model. But oftentimes the liberalized models seem to be losing out or not being workable, either through high rates of tax or through limits on the number of licensees allowed. So it's creating sort of a limited free market, if you will. And Jake, you mentioned it. You mentioned that in France, tax is the killer. Stephen, you didn't mention that in the UK. Yes, you can get a license, but tax is the killer, so no one really has. Everyone went down to Gibraltar. And that mimics what happened in the phone betting market, the taxation was too high in the UK and everyone just moved to Gibraltar, and then they happened to stay there.
I would just say on the UK on tax, if the UK were a closed market and it was coming along today with the market that it's proposing and its 15% rate of tax, people would be saying, you know, what a great market, this is terrific news, fantastic. It's only because it's a step backwards from where they are at the moment that it comes in for so much criticism.
Yeah, well, I think the UK is an interesting model. Essentially what happened, that the history behind all of it, going even further back than what you mentioned, Stephen, is they put together a white paper about 8 or 9 years ago. The white paper said, okay, we have this great idea. We have this online gaming thing. We want to be progressive. We need to amend our gaming laws because they're archaic. Theoretically, we believe that we're great licensors and great regulators. We could keep criminality out. We could keep problem gambling out. Keep children from gaming. Let's institute a regime, and only companies that have a UK license will be allowed to advertise in the United Kingdom. That was the recommendation in something called the Budd Report, written by a man named Sir Alan Budd. When the lawyers got a hold of it, they said, actually, this is contradictory to the Treaty of Rome in our promise with the European Union and our treaty with the European Union. So we can't actually stop other European licensed companies from advertising their gaming sites into the UK. Well, that was great news for, of course, Alderney and Malta and the Isle of Man and Gibraltar, who now had a huge number of licensees each advertising to the United Kingdom. But now I think the United Kingdom, like you're saying, is looking back and saying, gosh, we got this wrong. Apparently our opinion on what the Treaty of Rome means doesn't really apply anymore because no one bothered to fight that fight, which is sort of unfortunate because now we've got this patchwork of different gaming regulation throughout Europe. And that sort of brings us up, I think, to where we are today. But you'd think definitely in the UK the future will be, you will need a UK license, you will need to pay us 15%.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's only a matter of the saving grace for the industry is that the changes that were recommended in the report that Stephen was talking about require primary legislation. And given the history of gambling legislation in the UK, politicians, they got more than their fingers burnt last time. They don't want to go back there unless they can possibly avoid it. So the fact that primary legislation required is what's slowing the UK down. If it wasn't required, they'd already be doing it. So it's only a matter of legislative priorities. When it's the right time, or when they focus on it, once they've got rid of, dealt with more important things, they'll come onto it. And my best guess of timing is that it won't reach Parliament before at least a year. But you know, 1 to 2 years is a possibility.
Just to come about the European treaties, I mean, when the UK did what they did, I mean, you're right, they had their obligations under the treaty and they thought they knew what they were and they abided by them. I mean, in hindsight, maybe that you could say that was naive, but I don't think it was. I think it was the right thing to do at the time. Yeah. I think and as a lawyer that's worked in this industry for a while, I'm quite surprised at the way that the European treaty has been allowed in this particular instance to be so heavily politicized, and the way that, you know, all the freedoms that we thought were enshrined within the European legislation clearly aren't. So you know, now I think it's appropriate for the UK to revisit this. I do.
You're absolutely right. It is unfortunate for operators, of course, because you're right. In principle, this shouldn't be happening. Someone should have said, okay, we're going to mount a huge challenge, or an industry body could have mounted a challenge. But everyone decided it would be easier just to go out and get their new Italian license, which was the first jurisdiction really that created a big stir. So everyone just said, we'll pay the Italian license, we'll pay the fees. But now we're looking at a European market where we're going to have 20 different licensing regimes and 20 different tax structures and possibly no harmonization between them. And we're talking about regulatory costs, which could run in the millions. I think William Scott yesterday mentioned that they're spending in excess of something like $5 million in the U.S. just to manage its compliance and regulation. And you're looking at exactly that now for anyone wanting to operate in Europe. Is there any possibility of harmonization? To anyone on the panel?
I think Steve hit the nail on the head, really, when he said it's been politicized, because, I mean, the nature of the industry is what it is, and when you have massive interests, I mean, I know France well, and when you have massive interests and conglomerates like PMU and FDJ who do each 10 billion a year, you're talking about protecting markets, which for them, are their priorities. And gambling is always prone to that sort of debate. It's just the nature of the beast. I mean, and harmonization, not for a while. Not for a while. I mean, we've seen it in the Argel and AMS rapprochement, if I could say, recently. They've signed agreements of cooperation and exchange of information. But in terms of sharing poker liquidities and the like, which obviously operators would love, you have, they're not going to say anything about it. And also, you're talking about, can you imagine, say, Bayer Poker, who are operated in partnership with FDJ? Can you imagine them saying, oh yeah, sure, we'll open up all our competitors, we'll allow them to have shared liquidity with Italian poker players? It's just not going to happen. So I think, politicized is the word. And I think Germany was quite an interesting one because, we think of the lobbying the industry does, big groups like Bill Party, but really, if it's shown anything, it's the limit of its power because, the lotteries in Germany have just said, this is what's happening, and all right, there's a long way to play out, but it's not looking good. And that's the nature of the industry. I mean,
harmonisation at a European level occurs in other industries or through other concepts. I mean, for example, through intellectual property rights for efficiency purposes. I mean, if you think there's going to be harmonisation within this industry, as far as licenses is concerned, it won't happen because there's too important a fiscal imperative behind all of this. What I think that the green paper is quite interesting at this particular time. I mean, I've read some commentary just on the plane yesterday. Various people writing they think it's too late. The green paper, the horse has already been bolted. I disagree. I think that there could be harmonisation with respect to certain aspects of compliance, regulation, social responsibility. Because if you start looking at the detail in some of these regulations, as we've had to do for some of our clients who are really trying to work out, okay, what's the real cost of getting a license in this place? Yeah. You can look at the fee and the tax, but there's all these other hidden costs around compliance. That leads on to, one of the things I hope the Green Paper does achieve is that there could be a desire to at least try and harmonise on that level, at least, to make things easier for people. Because otherwise, you're going to have two or three that will be able to go everywhere and no one else will.
Rolf?
Yeah, in Norway we have a saying about don't swear in the church. And for many regulators to mention harmonization is swearing in the church. And I think one of the reasons you have to look at iGaming is not actually fully regulated in many European countries today. There are only a few countries actually regulated all down the line, sports betting, casinos and everything. And most jurisdictions aren't even allowed at all. So how can you actually harmonize something which isn't regulated? Because normally with harmonization you find something which is common and you find a common stand and we can make some common rules. But this isn't possible in gambling at now. But I do believe that iGaming has come. It's inevitable. It will be licensed. It will be allowed in every jurisdiction in Europe over the next 5 to 10 years. Within different models, of course. Mm-hmm. State monopoly connects to land-based, somewhere private markets. And then perhaps regulators might see some common denominators in the different markets who could actually create some sort of basis for cooperation. But they won't understand and see that before they actually regulate it and license themselves at a national level.
And harmonisation of any compliance needs to follow a license, yeah.
Let me throw a wrench in the works. So we mentioned the Treaty of Rome and how that should have allowed the free movement of services. Gambling is a service throughout the European Union. Now, the argument that certain countries put forth when they didn't want to allow foreign gaming operators to take bets from their citizens was that we actually have a different set of rules to protect our citizens. Doesn't harmonization literally throw that argument out the window? And therefore, I wouldn't actually need to pay tax. I could provide a service into another country simply because your argument that we have different protective measures is now gone.
You asking me?
Whoever wants to grab it.
Well, I think that
ball's in the air.
Yeah, I think that the level of protection, or what is regarded as level of protection, is different from country to country. I mean, gambling is a moral issue and a cultural issue in many countries, and that is different from country to country. So there is a disagreement on the level of protection, how to protect players?
I don't think it's about consumer protection. I mean, we see it in most recently in the UK consultation. I mean, for the reasons Stephen talked about, the UK goes out of its way to make a case for consumer protection, to say this is about consumer protection, it's not about tax. But we've all been in this game too long. It is about tax, it is about the money, so it doesn't matter what your arguments are on consumer protection, and if you nullify that argument, they'll find another one, and it'll come back to the fiscal imperatives that Stephen was talking about.
You're right. I mean, tax is one of the big issues. And what we're finding now is there are tax regimes that work and tax regimes that don't work. So if we take a look at France, and I feel bad that you're representing France here on this panel because all I'm doing is beating on you. But I know you beat on the French regulation probably harder than I do. So I'll take that as some solace. But tax is the big issue. And when you get it wrong, what happens? Well, actually, your players go elsewhere. You can't offer competitive pricing. You can't offer competitive deals. And literally, your players are going elsewhere. Tell me about your experience with that in France, Jake.
I mean, well, quite simply, I mean, many of you might have heard, I think Norbert's recent comments when they published some of their KPIs. I mean, he said only 30% of the legal the legal market only gets 30% of sports bets in France at the moment, which, if true, because no one really knows, if true, is really bad indictment of the regulation. I mean, we did that event in March this year, and I was talking to, with Jean-François Villot, the Argel president, and I said, lawmakers are employed to make laws. If the laws don't work, surely they're not doing their jobs properly. And which is the truth, but at the same time, you have the flip side of the coin, which is the two historical operators who don't really care because they have their market sewn up, they dominate it, and it's not really in their interest to have a better offer for the industry. So, you have these two different, people pulling in very different directions, and you go to an institutional meeting or parliamentary hearing, there's not much interest, to be honest, in the issue. There's not much will to really move it forward. And being French, well, hey, they do things their way, and that's unfortunately the situation at the moment. But yeah, it's like you say, if the regulation isn't good, the market doesn't really grow. But at the same time, like I said, you've got PMU and FDJ, still having 80% of the market or so to themselves. It's not a major issue for them. So how do you reconcile those two? On the private sector wanting to move forward, open it up, make it more progressive. On the other side, people who don't want to go in that direction. That's really the key, I guess, at the moment. And I'm the first to defend France, but I'm also the first to criticize it. And the review clause will give an idea of what might happen. But if not, there's a presidential elections next year, so nothing will happen then. And then after next year, maybe there'll be.
Yeah, I mean, as Jake says, if you don't get it right, the market doesn't grow, and we need to do as much work as an industry to get across. This argument applies across all jurisdictions. That if you get the tax rate right, if you get the regulation right, you actually get much higher revenues. Now, unfortunately, I'm told that this is what the tax authorities hear every day of the week. All different industries are telling them, tax us less, and you'll actually get more money, and they're quite skeptical. But in this case, it really is true.
But also, I mean, that raises an important point, because you talk to French politicians and you say, if you change the tax from stakes to gross gaming revenues, you will make more money, and they'll turn around and say, well, no, the reason they're on stakes is because it ensures a certain amount of tax revenue, and they don't seem to, or they don't want to, or they don't seem to. I don't know, but it's very difficult to make them understand the concept. If you have a tax system that is more progressive for the operators, you'll actually get more revenues. So the virtuous circle will be bigger. There'll be more reinvestment into, affiliate industry. Whether it's marketing, advertising, affiliates, all that stuff. But it's very difficult to make politicians understand that.
In fact, sorry. In fact, the French regulation is even worse than that, because it goes as far as to say there's a maximum amount of payout you could offer to your players. Somehow they decided that was part of consumer protection. I don't really get the logic in that. But clearly their idea was that if we make sure that the operators are at least taking X amount of profit will bring more tax into the system. But then again, you just don't have as competitive odds. You just don't have as competitive games. You just don't have as competitive bonuses. So people still just go offshore and play wherever they were playing before they had licensed operators in France. And the licensed operators in France all struggle. Are there any big success stories in that oppressive regime?
It's all sort of relative, isn't it? I mean, it's, you know...
Who's lost least?
That's a good question. No, I mean, there's no unmitigated success story because of the circumstances that we know. You know, the leaders now were the leaders before regulation. You know, horse racing, to be fair, probably doesn't get as much attention as sports betting because it's not as maybe glamorous, whatever. But it's historically, it's a very strong product in France. And, you know, the turf, the second operator after PMU, talks about 20% market share. But I wouldn't say there are any unmitigated success stories, basically. It's all, everyone is just hoping for this change on tax from stakes to gross gaming revenues, and, you know, fingers crossed.
I think looking at your title, I think, you know, restricted openings or monopoly rule. I think that the tax regimes that are being introduced, I mean, you need to see them in the, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the kind of the individual socioeconomic context of the jurisdictions in which they're being introduced. I mean, you could have a monopoly providing one kind of product or another that they want, the member state wants to continue to bolster up for whatever reason. Well, for financial reasons predominantly. So they can introduce a licensing regime and make it commercial to a degree. You know, you look at the German model and you think, I don't understand how anyone's ever going to go for that. The French model, again, when the first time we saw that, we thought that was as bad as it could possibly get. But then you look at the Spanish model, they want people to go and get licenses there, I think. I think that's what they're trying to do.
But are they going to limit it to 55 operators? I heard that number was battered around somewhere.
But, you know, but the way that they're structuring it seems to be relatively welcoming. As I said earlier on, the devil will be in the detail. But at least it's not the knee-jerk reaction to the German market where everyone's share price plummeted.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Again, it's quite hard to get excited about Spain, and when it's, you know, it is welcoming. It is, as Stephen says, it is they are going about the right way. But compared to the present situation, it's again a step backward. Coming back to the points that you were making earlier, Michael.
So you're saying that operators are better off now not paying any tax and operating in Spain and not being bothered about advertising?
Yeah, the only real upside to the national licensing regimes, I guess, is certainty for people who are looking for certainty that they're operating in a, but I'm clutching at straws here, but maybe if you're coming in from the US and you've got regulators to answer back to, or your listed companies, and you can say, well, yes, it's clearly legal, I've got a license, I'm operating in accordance with the license. But after that, I'd rather be operating in a monopolistic state using my EU law arguments and not paying taxes in every jurisdiction that I operate in.
I mean, the truth of the matter is that point that John's making about, you know, do people actually want licenses? Some people want licenses for reasons of clarity because that's what the market requires. There are an awful lot of operators who are not listed. They don't have that kind of added pressure. You know, what I think is particularly interesting with the sector at the moment is the way that it's polarizing. Okay, you've had a grey market for a long time, and we all tried to figure out what that grey market really meant to each of the individual operators and stakeholders, and now we're increasingly getting a black and white market. And that's going to suit some, on the white side, it's going to suit others on the black side. But ultimately, you're going to have these, as Jake was pointing out earlier on, there's an awful lot of business that is being done in the French market that is not going through those regulated operators. Someone's doing it, and people will continue to do that. The question from a lawyer's point of view will be whether they have a decent justification to do it or whether they are just breaking the law, but that's another matter.
So you brought up the point earlier. Is Europe now going to have to be run by massive PLC multinationals because there's so much compliance and regulation? Or are you just going to see the market fraction and become smaller individual operators operating, you know, very country specifically? So I'm a French operator, but someone else is a UK operator, but I don't necessarily want to be a French and UK operator. What do you predict going forward?
I think the clever operators, you know, you've got the very large ones that can have, you know, they can They've got their own in-house legal teams, regulatory teams, external advisors. They'll work themselves out, but it's the next level down I think is particularly interesting, and they are the ones that have got to engage in this and got to really work out where their business comes from, what kind of products they supply, where the development in regulation is going to be, and pick their spot. They can't do everything. I think gone is the time where people will have multi-jurisdictional offerings unless they are the very big operators. And I think that those that are just riding on the coattails of all of this and are not getting involved and not engaging in it and not trying to influence and lobby are the ones that will get left behind.
I mean, actually, you mentioned, are there any success stories in France? I mean, probably quite a few know it, but there's a company called Winamax who are, they're the second at the moment on .fr liquidity. They're second behind PokerStars. But even then, they have 70 staff. They're in Paris. They're really Franco-French, what they call Franco-French company, and they have done well. But even then, they are looking for investment at the moment. So, it requires so much investment, marketing, focus on the one product. In this case, one product. It's poker. And yeah, they've managed to do all right out of it, but even then they are looking for investment at the moment. So, it's always, it's a fine line between success and maybe not so great.
Do we have some audience questions? If not, I'm happy to continue with my own, but if you have one, just raise your hand. Okay, I'll keep going. I mean, all this is fantastic. I'm loving that there's some movement and that iGaming is recognized by governments, and that they're saying, okay, we should do something about it because it really exists. It's much better than burying your head in the sand and trying to extradite people and things like that. So it's in one way we're going in the right direction. Denmark, again, seems to be the model that all the gaming operators are looking at and saying, we could live with something like that. Spain, like you said, hopefully will follow suit. In fact, we're starting to license our poker brand, Bluff Magazine. We're getting licensee applications now from all of these jurisdictions as they open up. We were a company that wouldn't operate in a jurisdiction where we weren't explicitly able to advertise. So from my personal point of view, I kind of like what's going on. But I suppose the real question is, if Denmark gets it right, if Spain gets it right, and if the UK follows suit, sees two working models that are close to what they had intended originally, is there time now for other countries that have already enacted their legislation, maybe not France, but Italy or Estonia or other countries that currently have some statutes on the books, to come back and rewrite the statutes to go to a working model? Or are you going to be stuck with bad legislation? Ralph, this is probably a good question for you.
I think in Scandinavia, we've been very homogeneous for many years. We always had state monopolies, and now we seem to be going on different directions. Norway and Finland have decided to stick with monopolies. Denmark has decided to open up for a private licensing market, and Sweden doesn't know what to do. They're sticking in the middle. In Scandinavia, we look upon Denmark as a very interesting experiment, because they're basically changing completely with what they had before, and also leaving something which we still have today. So we're very interested to see how it's going to work, if they actually manage to contain the market, if they actually manage to stop operators targeting Denmark who don't have licenses. And it's also interesting to see how, if they actually manage to generate the same amount of revenues through a tax system rather than through a state monopoly. But I always believe that law and gaming law should actually reflect public opinion. And in Denmark, there is no major support for a monopoly anymore. And I think it's quite correct the way they're going. But in Norway, it's complete opposite. I mean, in Norway, there's a substantial public support for state monopoly today. Our monopoly is still very popular. Majority of Norwegians wish to maintain the monopoly, and basically that's because our law reflects that.
I don't know about public opinion, because in France, plenty of people really dislike plenty of players dislike the legislation, and the government just doesn't care. So.
But these cultural differences, coming out again. I mean, I think that you hear this phrase, the Danish model, and part of your question is whether the Danish model should be applied in other jurisdictions, or will it be applied in other jurisdictions? It works for Denmark. It may not work for other places. I mean, if Denmark,
it works commercially for the operator. That's the important thing.
If Denmark was going to open itself up in the way that the French did, or not open itself up, require initially a lot of infrastructure and etc. within the jurisdiction, ring-fence liquidity, etc. I wonder how many people would be interested in getting a license in the Danish market. they've introduced a system which I think they needed to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a small market. If it was oppressive and if it had ridiculous taxation and it was too officious to run your business there, then you're absolutely right. No, you wouldn't bother with that market and then just have players in the gray market. So I see your point, but I guess the point I was trying to make is the operators find that model palatable enough that they think they could actually run a good business and offer value to the player, which is really what we need to do. We're in the entertainment business. It's a unique entertainment product in the sense that the player actually chooses exactly how much it's going to cost. They choose their stakes. So that threw me off. That little bell. I'm like Pavlov. Anyway, so I mean, it's unique, but it needs to be within a working framework for the operator. They need the ability to offer enough value to keep the games juicy. It's probably the right way to put it. With the Olympics coming up in the UK in 2012, will there be additional pressure to implement any regulations prior to that event happening, such as the World Cup in France did for France?
Sorry, in the same way as the bell triggered a Pavlov reaction with you, you mentioned the Olympics, and I thought of my £6,000 worth of tickets that I might be on the hook for if I.
They keep sending those emails as well, saying, "Make sure you got $6,000 on your card." And my card only does $5,000.
It's a strange system, but I don't think there isn't really any sort of link between the Olympics and nobody's made that connection. It's an original thought that I've heard here today from you, Michael, but nobody's talking about the two together.
I'm bearing in mind, our system is meant to, from a regulatory point of view, meant to work. It's just from a sort of fiscal point of view, they're reviewing it. I thought my $2.5 was quite punchy.
I think everyone I've talked to have applied for the opening ceremony tickets, so I don't think anyone's going to get them. So I wouldn't even worry about those. And those were the expensive ones. Questions from our audience? Oh, good.
Okay, now I'm going to start to talk, and then they'll come over. This is a bit of a carry.
Could all finalists for the IGSOP please go to poker tables 1 and 2?
This is probably a carryover from the session pre-lunch, but there was a question about whether or not there would be a U.S.-European merger activity and whether there'd be interest in that. And hearing the discussion as a Yank about all of the various different regulatory regimes, frankly, the U.S. Operators, particularly the licensed operators in the U.S., have been dealing with that forever. They've got that down to a science. Doesn't that argue for actually more consolidation in the industry around that? People who are very used to working in very different regulatory markets and complying with different licensing and tax regimes.
Yes, I mean, it lends itself to that kind of consolidation. There's only a few of them that are going to be able to cope with it. I mean, the cost of compliance with one license is enough. Cost of compliance with a whole myriad of them and all that it entails to get them and then maintain them, I think, is something else. So I think that lends itself to consolidation such that there will only be a handful, maybe 2 or 3 pan-European global internet gaming businesses in 10 years' time, as well as perhaps some of their tie-ups with the US businesses. But as a lot of the other ones, the other brands that we know, I think will become more regional focused. I think, but I don't know what anyone else thinks.
I suppose if there is going to be EU-US consolidation, a lot of it is in the hands of US regulators, and I'm not sure how far they are down the line in being in understanding the European market. Understandably so. It's not intended as a criticism, but they need to understand the legal arguments that operators are running across Europe, so that they can get comfortable with their licensees coming over to Europe and getting involved in businesses in Europe. And there have been examples in the land-based sector. I think was it MGM in New Jersey, where they had to choose between their Macau license and their New Jersey license, and after thinking about it for a couple of seconds, they decided to go with their Macau license. But it's much more complex on an online perspective.
It's kind of sort of a corporate culture question as well. There's there are big U.S. interests currently who could come to Europe, and if they decided our expertise lies in being compliant with different regulations, there are several jurisdictions right now they could walk into and apply for licenses. They haven't. Gaming tends to be sort of done on a regional basis, especially with European gaming operators, and that's generally because of anomalies in the laws and anomalies and difficulties in regulation cross-border. I guess it's going to be the big online guys. Sorry. It's going to be the big online guys that have the real experience to offer the multi-jurisdictional online gaming offers, the BWin parties, for instance, and maybe more mergers like that on the online side, where you bring Winamax together with an Italian poker company, or something along those lines. Although, of course, you can't pull liquidity at the moment due to the anomalies in the French law, which somehow make you segregate your French players into one pool, but apparently you could allow players from other countries to come and play in that pool as well. Another anomaly on a poorly drafted law, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll get some changes in 6 months, which will never happen. Okay, more questions from our audience. Yes.
Obviously, we've touched on the issue of unlicensed operators. We've touched on the issue of unlicensed operators. Once you license a market, then the amount that remains offshore, and France is a prime example, and for operators that choose to go and pay taxes, it's not in their interests, actually, if a lot of other operators remain offshore and are much more competitive on a pricing basis because they're not paying those taxes. And I wanted to ask Rolf in particular, how effective you thought, and you did touch on this with Denmark, how effective you thought it could be to block unlicensed operators, either obviously through the payments mechanism or through ISP blocking.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear the last part.
How big is the offshore industry still, the unlicensed offshore industry still in Norway, actually?
Okay.
And how effective is it to block unlicensed operators when you're in a licensed regime, either through payments processing or through ISP blocking?
Well, in Norway today, we don't do IP blocking. That's highly controversial in Norway. It just connects with the freedom of speech and censorship, so we don't do IP blocking. So we do the payments blocking. But today, I got the actual numbers here with me. The Norwegian Gaming Authority does surveys every year, and we estimate about 378,000 Norwegians who play online every year, and 55% of them play on Norwegian sites, 25% play on overseas sites, and 19% play on both. And we see a turnover of around 7.3 billion Norwegian crowns, and 2.6 billion of this goes to Norwegian sites, and 4.7 billion goes to overseas sites. So we're actually getting more people playing on Norwegian sites, and less people playing on overseas sites, but there's more money going outside Norway than inside Norway. And so basically all the high rollers are probably, they choose to play overseas.
So what's your plan to deal with that?
Well, the plan is basically, I think we need to offer national interactive gaming inside Norway, because the people who play online in Norway are basically playing sports betting with our state monopoly. So we need to start offering other games than just sports betting and see if we can channel and get more people to play on national gaming sites. No.
The question was, will you allow other
Like I
operators
said,
in? Rolf said no.
You know, and I think when you're assessing a licensing regime, you've got to work out why am I going to go and get a license there. I mean, I understand from the listed point of view, you've got that decision to make, and we've already talked about the other legal arguments you can or cannot, for continuing to target a business. But if you look at a jurisdiction, you think, okay, what if I get a license here, what are you going to do to keep all these other people out? The UK in their consultation document, they said they're not going to do financial transaction blocking, they're not going to do ISP blocking, they're not going to try and enforce it extraterritorially. Okay, so what exactly are you going to do? Because one of the values in getting a license, other than the local advertising, this kind of stuff, is you should be carving a whole load of other people out of the market. So I think that's something that the regulators need to get more involved in. I mean, BWIN particularly was speaking to, there was sort of a note to Argel last week about, what are you doing about all these offshore bookmakers? What are they doing?
That's a really good question. No, but I mean, it illustrates exactly what we're talking about. You've got Argel have taken out injunctions against, I think it was 5 dimes in Costa Rica. It took them like 4 months. 5 letters, obviously no response anyway, and for an activity from really a small site. Meanwhile, you've got licensed operators still offering online casino products to French players because they'd registered pre-regulation. So you've got all these issues, and you've got people like the biggest commercial channel like TF1 still offering casino games, but because they enable the player to get reimbursed if they so wish. It's written about this big at the bottom of the page. They're allowed to do that. You've got M6, another commercial channel that does that. You've got FDJ offering online bingo. So you've got all these dichotomies, like, things, but they offer bingo because they had a special derogation from pre-regulation. They can offer handicap bets offline, but not the online guys can't do that. And so you've got all these issues, which clearly you think, well, the regulation is, it just isn't really that effective. But it's a slow political process that has to be gone through, I guess, before we get anywhere near the light, which is maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Who knows?
John, you want to add something?
I was just going to add in response to the question that the UK is hoping later down the line, and Denmark will have this as well, that greater regulatory cooperation will give them greater powers of enforcement. So if you've got a licensee from another jurisdiction taking bets in Denmark without a license, they can speak to the regulator in that jurisdiction and say, we're not happy about this. So combined with their blocking and combined with the inability to advertise in the jurisdiction itself as a disadvantage against the licensed operators, all these things begin to add up and start to direct potential operators to actually going and getting a license rather than staying out.
So, to summarize our panel, to summarize our session, restricted openings versus monopoly rule. The reality is it doesn't really make a difference because depending on the country, there will be a decision either to have monopoly rule or a restricted opening in a limited licensing system. The reality is, what kind of business do you want to be going forward, knowing that this is the terrain ahead? Are you going to be the big multinational, party type BWIN and get licensed, or poker stars and get licensed everywhere? Are you going to be the local regional operator, which historically, forever and ever and ever throughout time, is what's developed throughout Europe in the land-based market? Or 3, are you going to be the offshore guy and go completely into the black market and offer better pricing? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer, but it seems like these are the 3 options that you're going to have, given that this is clearly the 2 paths that each country within the European Union will go down. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me thank our panel.